As I mentioned earlier, as we close out this year, I want to invite you to join Family Research Council in preparing for even bigger challenges and opportunities in 2024 by making a timely tax-deductible year-end gift today. With your help, we'll be ready to persuasively counter the left's radical big government, pro-abortion, pro-LGBT agenda. So give us a call today, and your gift will actually be matched if you give before December 31st. So give us a call, 800-225-4008. That's 800-225-4008. And as I've mentioned before, we receive no government money. We're not NPR. We're Washington Watch. In her first appearance before Congress in her new role as director of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, Dr. Mandy Cohen said last week the public should not be alarmed despite a spike of respiratory illnesses in China and despite limited information from the Communist Party there. The director's comments harken back to the Chinese government's deceptive withholding of information 3 years ago, as well as the eventual overreaction from U.S. authorities that led to lockdowns, school closures, and masking toddlers on playgrounds. The question is, have we learned from the mistakes of 2020? And, forgive me, but I'm suspect as we move into an election year and we hear all these talks about rising illness rates and even triple-demics. What's that? Well, joining us to talk about this, Dr. J. Bhattacharya, professor of health policy at Stanford University, and one of the authors of the 2020 Great Barrington Declaration, which advocated for an alternative approach to COVID-19. Dr. Bhattacharya, welcome back to Washington Watch.
Thank you for having me.
So let's talk about this. There's some alarm bells going off. We see what's happening in China, and we see people talking about, this could be a really bad winter, this triple-demic where we've got 3 different types of pathogens out there. What should we be looking for?
Well, I think the Chinese report was interesting, in part because the response of the WHO to it was so different than its response to the COVID announcement by China. They sent a team out there and they came back and said, look, this is, it was actually what's essentially what has happened is that there is a immunity deficit because of the lockdowns that the Chinese had, so that there are children that are 4 years old that are being exposed to a bug for the first time that they might have been exposed to earlier, and they would have dealt with much better if they'd been exposed to it earlier. And it's causing something called walking pneumonia. Now, we have ways to treat it. The levels were higher in 2019. The disease is not just in China. It's basically everywhere on Earth. There have been reports in Netherlands, for instance, of an uptake in cases and so on. So I don't see this as a cause for alarm. It's just interesting to see how the media has responded to it to try to essentially bring COVID back into the
Is it the fear mongering? Is it the fear mongering that they're after?
Yeah, that's what it looks like to me. This is the kind of thing where doctors should know about it, epidemiologists should know about it, but there's no reason on earth to panic the population about it. What do? You can close schools to avoid kids getting this bacteria? No, the key thing is to not make people panicked over something that is entirely manageable. And I think even the triple-demic that you mentioned, Tony, I think the thing is, think about that. Every respiratory virus season, we have multiple viruses pass around among large numbers of people. That we don't have any way of controlling that. And we don't suspend our civilization every time we have respiratory viruses floating around, because we know that would cause much more harm than good. Most of the people that are at risk, we can help with all kinds of means to try to help reduce that risk. But for the vast majority of the population, these respiratory viruses are nothing but a cold. I don't really understand. I guess I understand in one sense now that based on what we've been through the last 3.5 years, what people are doing. But here it's just panic mongering in a way that just doesn't, I think, is not helpful. In a way, I guess the WHO finally did learn something. They were much better with this than they were with COVID.
It makes sense in an election year. To me, that's my concern, is that we're going to hear all of this fear mongering, in an election year, which is going to, either make people stay home, not go out and vote, or allow the governments to manipulate like they did last time. But I want to go back to something you said, because I think this is really, really important to learn from, and there's not much introspection on what government did during COVID. And you talk about the immunity debt, the deficit. And that's why actually we're seeing this uptick in these respiratory issues. We're seeing them even in some of here in the United States. I know Ohio's been having some issues there. But it's because we had these masks on, we had people locked down, and the normal things that you're exposed to, which you then begin to build an immunity to, we don't have it because we took this wrong-headed approach. Am I correct?
You're 100% correct. It was very, very short-sighted. It's as if the idea got into people's heads that we could somehow conquer all disease. All we had to do was lock down for long enough. No, but what actually ends up happening is that you delay the time that you get the disease to when you're older. And you're going to be more vulnerable generally. For children especially, it's actually quite important that they live a normal life so that their bodies can get trained to cope with the pathogens they're going to face their entire lives. Our entire Earth is filled with these pathogens. We some of them are we couldn't live without. Our gut bacteria, for instance, help process foods for us. Others are pathogenic and actually can cause harm, but we learn to deal with them sometimes by vaccination, sometimes by experience, I have the idea in your head that you could somehow avoid germs forever is as far from reality as one can imagine. And when you try to play around with those kinds of ideas and implement them at scale, like we did with the lockdowns, you're going to cause unintended consequences, right, unintended harm, and that's, I think, partly what we're seeing now.
It's like thinking you can avoid paying taxes; they will eventually get you. So this is my concern, Dr. Bhattacharya, so we know that. We now see this. We see this uptick. I think maybe last winter was a part of that as well, and we may have a large number of people that have respiratory issues because of this deficit of immunity. So we need to make sure we don't repeat what we did so that we get more of this by responding the way we did in COVID. Are you concerned that might be a response that we see?
I've been watching the UK's COVID inquiry with considerable interest, Tony. I don't know if you've paid attention to this, but it's been very interesting to me because a lot of the people and ideas that were catastrophically failed during the pandemic, lockdowns, school closures, mask mandate, vaccine mandates, all these catastrophically failed ideas, instead of querying those and asking why, well, how did we get it so wrong? What's the reason for the failure? How can we do better next time? Instead, the overall tenor of the inquiry, the overall sort of line of the inquiry is around how come we didn't lock down earlier? How come we didn't copy China more? A lot of the official inquiries that have happened, I mean, if you look, for instance, in the United States, we haven't had an official inquiry, but we had, for instance, Phil Zelikow wrote a book. He was the guy that did the 9/11 Commission report. He wrote a book looking at COVID, and essentially it's the same kind of lines. Like, how come the tenor seems to be, well, why didn't we lock down earlier? Why didn't we be more draconian? Draconian policy is not the way to manage pandemics. That essentially what ends up happening is you cause catastrophic harm in other areas, and you don't even manage to get out of COVID either, right?
Right.
I think we have not yet had anywhere in the world an honest inquiry run by people almost all of these inquiries have been run by people who have a vested interest in trying to make people think they did the right thing when evidently they didn't.
That explains then your recent post on X, which I think you're no longer being suppressed on. You wrote this, quote, "Scientists embraced pseudoscience in the COVID era, including school closures and toddler masking. Scientists push censorship and authoritarian power. Scientists are likely the cause of the pandemic itself," end quote. I mean, I'm quoting you correctly?
You were quoting me correctly. They're all depressing things. Toddler masking I put in there because it's just so obviously ridiculous. It's almost unimaginable to me that scientists embraced it. But the context of that quote is that there was a Pew study that asked about the extent to which Americans have trust in scientists, and that has collapsed over the past few years. And to some extent, it's a partisan collapse, where with more of a collapse for Republicans than for Democrats. But for both groups, both Democrats and Republicans have seen scientists seen a big decline, and it's fully earned that collapse in trust. Tony, I mean, all of those things scientists did, and there's been no reckoning, no recognition by scientists that those catastrophic mistakes. And by the way, I don't mean to impugn the vast majority of scientists are ethical and good people.
Understood.
What I mean to say is that the leadership of our scientific communities made these catastrophic mistakes, and they're going around giving themselves awards, pretending like they did nothing wrong. Is it any surprise that the public has said, no, we don't trust you guys anymore?
So the first step, if in fact they care and they want to restore trust in these institutions, which quite frankly, I think is important that we trust our doctors and our scientists, but it's shredded, that trust is shredded. But would not the first step be to acknowledge, hey, we didn't get it right, and we actually do want to look at this honestly and see how we can do better next time?
That is absolutely the first step. I mean, I think that if it's been shocking to see how little of that kind of introspection that you're talking about has been done by our scientific leaders. Even the new set of leaders who are replacing the old ones, the new head of the NIH, the new head of the CDC, they'll mouth words about like accountability and trying to especially the new CDC leader is going around trying to say that she wants to rebuild trust, and yet her actions and her words basically say, well, she just doesn't think they did anything wrong, really, that they just somehow didn't fail to persuade people that they were right, when in fact they were evidently wrong about item after item after item. The CDC in particular, what I hold them to blame for not pushing for open schools when the evidence from Sweden and Europe was very, very clear. I hold them to blame for continuing to push for toddler masking when there's not one shred of good evidence in favor of it. How do she expect to have people to regain trust when they still are doubling down on absolute nonsense?
Well, Dr. Bhattacharya, I would actually go a little further in that not only are they not regaining trust, they're increasing the suspicion that they're setting the stage to yet do it once again, the next time they have the opportunity.
Tony, I wish I could disagree with you about that, but I think that the lockdown, panic mongering, censorship, authoritarian control is now the new template for how we manage pandemics in this country and around the free world. If you think that your kids are going to be able to go to school, if you think you're going to be able to keep your small business running, if you think you're going to keep your job, if you think you're going to be able to have informed consent for medical products, well, I mean, I think all of those things that were like absolute bedrocks of what I thought public health was about was to essentially have proportionality and commitment to human rights. All of those things are out the window now. The new template is what happened during the pandemic. We will lock down again the next time there's a respiratory virus pandemic. We will have public health fearmonger. We will have the media join in. We will have every single element of the policies that we followed last time will come back again because it was successful. It was successful for the group of small group of scientific leaders who were giving themselves awards and promoting themselves. It was successful for large pharmaceutical companies. It was successful for a certain group of politicians who cemented wins. There is no doubt in my mind that unless there is an honest reckoning where we look back and say, look, these were mistakes and we're not going to make them again. Here are the systematic ways we're going to reform our systems so we don't make those mistakes again. Unless we do that will happen again, guaranteed.
I don't know if you can answer this question in the minute and a half we have left, but how do we, as American citizens, as voters, as moms and dads, how do we keep this from happening again?
I think the most important thing is that you can ask your leaders whoever you're voting for, from like dog catcher to president, what are you going to do the next time there's a pandemic? Are you going to close my schools down? What guarantees are can I have that you're going to have a wide range of advice before you make that decision? You'll account for the harm you're doing to my children. Are you going to if at the national level? How do you plan to reform the CDC? How do you plan to reform the FDA? How do you plan to reform the NIH so that you don't fund dangerous research ever, of the sort that we funded that probably led to the pandemic? How are you going to make sure that the CDC actually listens to outside voices? How are you going to make sure that the FDA regulates the pharmaceutical industry rather than be captured by it? I think every single voter should be asking every single elected official that question, because it's not like we can just go back to normal. That ship has sailed. Right. We have to push our elected leaders to do the right thing.
All right. We will do that, and they need to be looking to sources that will tell them the truth, which we're right there. Washington Watch. Dr. Bhattacharya, thank you so much for joining us. Always great to talk with you, and Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas. Thank you, Tony.